You're listening to Ecosysteming, the podcast redefining economic development through the lens of equitable entrepreneurship. Join NC Idea's Tom Rue as he engages with entrepreneurs and experts who are challenging the status quo and driving lasting change.
Hello, listeners of the Ecosysteming podcast. I am excited to share with you today my guest, Tom Snyder, Executive Director of Riot. Tom, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be in the studio.
You know, we know each other, and that'll become self-evident here in about a second. But for the benefit of listeners who may not, could you start with just sharing a little bit of biographic background information on you?
Happy to. I'll start with Riot as an organization. We are an economic development platform company is how we think of us. If you're working in the tech space, you always call yourself a platform. If you can't write it, sounds better. But fundamentally, we're trying to help in a lot of the ways that NC Idea is to unlock entrepreneurial potential in places where that hasn't happened, and to help people to take control of their own destiny through creating a company, starting an early stage venture. Economic development involves lots of other things that we'll probably talk about as we go through the show here. My background, though, I'm an engineer. I worked in big multinational companies for more than 20 years and saw the potential that emerging technologies provide to solve problems in every market sector. Fundamentally, our economy has always been driven by emerging technology. So we work in the tech space, but what I didn't like in these giant companies was how often success was really just measured through profitability at a shareholder level and not through the contributions of individuals. And I think small businesses are the backbone, of our economy. And so we launched this nonprofit to help grow that middle class.
Well, speaking of, though, your impressive background in, big companies doing product development, you led cross-functional engineering teams, and with that important designation, cross-functional. First of all, what does that mean, and why is that important?
Early in my career, I'm a mechanical engineer, and I was leading mechanical teams. And then as I kind of advanced my organization, I started working across multiple engineering disciplines, and then started having multiple engineering disciplines across multiple time zones around the globe, and so on and so forth. Continued to bring more and more different functions and viewpoints. That was through the hierarchy of a large org chart where there were just maybe more and more folks that I was responsible for in some way. But what I learned was that diversity is one of the most powerful kind of force multipliers in creating success. If everyone thinks the same way, you're just going to get the thing that you always knew was going to happen. When you bring different viewpoints together, you can innovate and you can do new things. And those viewpoints and that diversity comes across in terms of different technical training and background, technology, business, social sciences, etc. It also comes across through people that have different lived experiences because they come from different places, different communities, they're different colors, different backgrounds, et cetera, et cetera. And so I just had the good fortune in big companies to experience diversity through just the sheer size. But now, as we work with smaller communities, we look at how do we bring that forward in other ways.
As is always the case when I talk to you, you get my brain going in like 12 different tangents. And so just now hearing that, it jarred a memory. A few years back, as I'm sure you were aware, VW had this big emissions scandal, the diesel emissions scandal. As a matter of fact, I think at long last, an executive is facing jail time in Germany for this. And I remember thinking back then at how many levels within such a big company did there have to be like a product development, a compliance, like failures, right? That allowed ostensibly a cheating solution, right? I mean, it was cheating, right? They were they were stuffing the ballot box, so to speak. Like, think about at how many levels there had to be a failure in the system that it got to the point that they put something out into the market with so many people aware that they were cheating. What would you say to that? Like,
My response would be that I'll start by just giving a disclaimer. I am not involved with VW in any way. I don't have any insider knowledge, right? But I
same.
worked in large organizations and I saw behaviors that were common, even in really good companies. And I don't believe it's as complex as it sounds as you describe it. I think that there is, unfortunately, a very singular decision making, I'll call it a rudder maybe, or a North Star within large organizations, which is purely profitability. The only measure of success in a big company like VW is profitability. And it is going to steer every behavior at every level in that company. That what you described as all the mistakes that were made, it was a whole bunch of small decisions that over time took them towards a profitability decision versus perhaps a decision that says profitability is one measure, ethical standards is another measure, success of our individual employees and their career development is another measure, impact on our local communities where we have offices is another measure. Like, companies used to have multiple measures of what success meant to the company. And in today's modern society, the only measure is the dollar, or I guess the euro in VW's case.
Yeah, certainly Boeing, I think, is the more current example that would make that point
100%.
that you're making there, right? I mean, you look at that, and then the old business adage is that planes don't collapse and crash because of one big catastrophic failure. It's a series of failures, of small ones that kind of daisy chain on top of each other to the point that you have that failure. Thank you for indulging my little divergent brain there, and I'm
Absolutely, absolutely. And if you want evidence of that at the local level, go out to any big park on a Saturday morning and look who sponsors all the local soccer teams. You don't see the big Fortune 500's names on the logos and the jerseys of the local communities. It's the small businesses and the others that are still measuring not only profitability, but other things. A big company, you go to them and they're going to say, oh, yeah, like, we can't make that kind of a spend. Of course you can. You're the richest companies on earth. But that's a behavior, that's another example of this behavior of only one thing mattering.
so, all right, you're to blame from this point forward because you just got my lizard brain to go to the next thing you said. Speaking of one of the richest companies in the world, and you and I have talked about this ad nauseum. There was one of a year or two ago that made a big grand announcement, moving to North Carolina. This little company named after a piece of fruit, coming to the the park, actually. So right here in the Triangle. And all it took to convince them was nearly $1 billion in incentives and deferred tax revenues and things of that nature. I always laugh when these stories come out, and I laugh just to cover my anger, truth be told. And what's interesting to me is that they're always framed in the context of, big co to invest $1 billion in a factory here, right? And that's like considered an investment in our community when in fact that's just cost of doing business, right? They have to build the factory regardless of where it lands. And then that building, to your point, right? They're not letting the little leaguers play in the 40 acres of green space that they wanted to have for their own views, right? It's not a community asset. You're not having your niece's quinceanera there on a weekend, right? In their beautiful glass, lobbies. So I always take issue with the characterization that it's an investment. An investment in what? It's a cost of doing business for them, right? Now I'll tell you what, and the benefits are deferred. The ROI is measured in decades, not years, right? But what's immediate, the impact. Construction, traffic, infrastructure strains, all that. So we take we take the bad part of that immediately, and then on the if come, we say, yeah, something good will come from it. I can't even believe I'm asking it, but I have to for the sake of our listeners because they don't know you as well as I do. Like, what are your thoughts on that, Tom?
I know that our listeners are listening to this not live as we're recording, but it happens that last night was the final home game for the Oakland A's in a similar situation. A community that loved a baseball team that was there for 60 some years, and they're moving to Las Vegas, where I would guess 3/4 of the fans at any game are going to be tourists, right? Not even there for the local community at all built around the profitability of the owner at the very top. At a state level, at a city and county level, these economic incentives to bring a giant company into your region, one, they're extremely expensive. They tend to be empty promises. In North Carolina, I don't know the exact data, but I believe more than half of the companies that get these incentives ultimately do not fulfill, and then later kind of renege on it. But what has happened is that politician that helped to bring that in got reelected, right? These are more about the image of them and how it reflects on things like elections, I believe, than they are really about economic development and impact. They're great stories, but they don't really have the outcome that a small business can have. Particularly in our case, we work with technology businesses. So as we help new tech startups come in, the nature of the tech sector is those are high paying jobs. That high paying salary that you can pay an employee in a small tech company circulates through an economy to support your Main Street restaurant and retail, your arts and entertainment, your other industries that maybe aren't paying at a higher salary. And that's a separate conversation. Why aren't they being paid? These are important parts of our society. But giving tax incentives to a bunch of overpaid executives to do the cost of doing business, as you described, whether that's building a stadium or whether that's building a corporate headquarters. Why would you do that? Especially when it's not the headquarters. At the end of the day, one day that business may not do as well. They're probably not going to cut their headquarters building. They're going to cut that satellite office despite the tax incentives that came. If you grow a local business that started in a place, you're going to see much stronger loyalty to the place. That's a much better economic strategy.
Oh, absolutely. I remember research from my time at the Kauffman Foundation pointed to the fact that, where a fortune is made is loyal to the region until the third generation. And then by the third generation, right, the kids have, went off to boarding schools and they have relationships that are national, if not global in nature. So that tie to the community where it was born is more and more tenuous. But I mean, that still gives you a good 50, 60 years to enjoy that benefit.
And I'd like to add a point to this because we do a lot of our work in smaller and rural communities. And one of the challenges in a lot of smaller communities is the economy is always changing. Markets are always changing, and they're being changed primarily by changes in technology. Um, Globalization, of course, impacted manufacturing and created a rust belt. Digitization is creating a digital rust belt. And so communities that are not applying AI, using broadband, doing things in kind of technology and data centric ways are going to be left behind. In rural communities, what happens today is that a younger generation is going off to school and they're not returning to their communities to take over the family business because in many cases the family business can't digitize because there's not sufficient broadband access or other kinds of things. And the communities we work in, we try and help put the right infrastructure for a new economy so that the kinds of businesses can be built that the generation does come back because people do want to work in those family businesses. They do want to create that second generation, that third generation that you described. Without the infrastructure, they can't. And when they leave, you don't have a workforce And that is part of the challenge in our rural areas.
Yeah. Let's I'm going to dive into it and give you an opportunity to give a little more specificity on the work that Riot does. I'm going to preempt that though with a little bit of more background on you, because we both started in our respective roles around the same time. I think within 3 months of each other. We're both coming up on about 9 years in the captain's seat, so to speak. And you were Riot was in our initial cohort. We did 7-ish years ago. We experimented with this notion of ecosystem partners, right? What if we could help fund capacity of some trusted partners doing things that make sense with our notion and definition of economic development? And you and I have been in the trenches together for all that time and have seen some change here. Consider that part two of the question. Part one of the question would be like, so, with, again, a little more specificity to somebody that has not heard of Riot, what does Riot do? And then back to the second part of that question, how has your work evolved? How do you see the ecosystem having evolved over this time that we've worked together?
Great questions. Starting with the first part, at first, I'm going to give a public thank you here on this program. I actually started a little bit earlier than you described. We launched Riot in March of 2014. I did not have any ability to actually pay myself or any employees until that first ecosystem grant. And so we were doing this as a volunteer effort for a little while, but the recognition that NCIDEA had in the work that we did enabled us to take revenue that we were driving that was just covering our direct costs in terms of running events and doing things, to actually starting to build a team. And so thank you for that, and thank you to the hundreds of other sponsors and customers we've had since then. To answer the second half of the question, when we started the organization in 2014, I was recognizing a fundamental shift in the economy. I had been fortunate to start my career at the point that there was a tipping point in that radio technology was moving from analog to digital, which enabled things like smartphones and whatever. But this was way before smartphones. But the ability to create mobile connectivity was happening at the same time that this little thing called the internet was launching. And that was where I was fortunate enough to just enter the workforce. And I saw how that technology changed every single industry. We saw similar fundamental changes in moving from an information age to what I call a data economy around about 2014, where high-speed wireless networks were allowing, at scale, near zero cost transfer of information. IoT, the Internet of Things, was allowing at scale near zero cost to collect data from sensors. So we can collect the data for free, we can move it around with networks for free, and compute infrastructure, cloud infrastructure, had reached a scale that the cost of compute was near zero to analyze and start to do AI and ML kinds of things. We started just as a convener, bringing people together to understand the opportunity. And every big technology company, I'm not going to call any of them out, but they're household brands you've heard of, they started coming to us saying, it's great that you're having these conversations, that you're bringing people together to understand how we need to fundamentally change our businesses and how we can start to solve problems in new ways with these technologies. And that's where startups started coming out and engaging with us. Initially, we were just a convener and an educator, but the fact that every company, including a lot of the brands that you would think are the experts, were coming to us for help showed us that there's a real market need, there's a real opportunity. A number of years later, we started running accelerator programs and things to purposefully educate entrepreneurs. So we remain today as an organization an educator, a convener and connector, and a support organization to bring the right resources to entrepreneurs to start and scale programs. We've run 18 cohorts now of a startup accelerator with hundreds of companies that have created, I think 500 jobs, raised a few $100 million, done a lot of positive impact in their communities. The most recent area that we've gotten into to kind of complete our Riot resume, if you will, is we're working in a number of communities where we work directly with the local government on their economic development strategy and their ecosystem building to focus on how can we as a community grow new businesses in our community to kind of complement that big game hunting that you talked about of let's do a tax incentive and a site plan to try and get an existing employer to come into our community. Communities are starting to realize it's a better strategy to invest our financial resources and our time resources into supporting the entrepreneurs that are already here rather than try and convince somebody to make a temporary move into the community.
Oh, that's part of what confounds me when we have these conversations is that isn't is obvious to policymakers, and elected officials and people that are being tasked with economic development charters that it's not as obvious to them as it is to us, right? And so I fight that fight, and I opine about that and take pot shots at these big, large S deals. Until recently, Secretary Elaine Marshall's office came out with data, and this is where I hope this is kind of like a dam breaking moment where we see more and more data to challenge these long held, what I'll call old school buffalo hunting, smokestack chasing practices. A press release that came out of the Secretary's office said that we being North Carolina continue to be at record startups, going from year to year. We're like in our 5th year now, at a very good pace. And that if we could help 5%, just 5%, I think it was, of the companies started in the last 5 years, if we could help at least 5% of them get to, and I would call this a very nominal revenue run rate, namely $50,000 a year revenue or higher. Okay. If we could help 5% of the 5-year-old or younger companies get to 50,000 in revenue, her office estimates the economic impact annually in 1 year would be $1.5 to $2 billion.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, why is this not just the stupidly easy thing to decide, right? To say nothing of the job creation engine that it is. We know this through our own data. We look historically at the 600-ish companies that we have funded over nearly 20 years. You can say all the great vanity metrics they've gone on and raised, over $1 billion in private equity. But the bigger number is they've created over 5,000 jobs. And if you want to look at us as a catalyst for that, because for well over 95% of all the founders we fund, we're the first money in. So we're not going to take like credit that they, succeeded, but we're usually the very, very first external validation and money in. So if you want to use that as a metric, we did this math a while ago. You take how much our programs have put in divided by the number of jobs created. It's a cost like $2,400 per job, per high paying job, to your earlier point, right? Look at that compared to the next time you hear one of these deals that somebody got $240 million in tax incentives for the promise of 800 jobs. I always take those headlines and I divide the price tag by the number of jobs promised, and it's usually an obscene number. I think Apple's right now at the top of that pile, to something like almost $200,000 per job promised, yeah. Right? So, okay, we'll spend $200,000 for the promise of one job. I mean, it's good business if you can get it, right?
It flies in the face of any way that, say, a venture capitalist would think, right? VCs make these early bets, and they're looking for multiples of return. It's by far the most expensive capital that could go into a startup company. If they were going to take a line of credit or some other form of debt, they're going to pay, a small percentage, a few percent interest. If they take venture capital, they're going to pay, 10x the cost of that money to pay it back to that investor one day. If
exactly.
The state thought like a VC, VCs are smart folks. They make these investments because they're smart investment. Imagine if, say, the state of North Carolina were to say that let's find the 100 top entrepreneurial support organizations, which tend to be nonprofit organizations in the state, and we're going to annually fund each of them at $1 million. So they put a 100 million in. You would hit far more than that 5% number that you just described. But to put 100 million in to get 2 billion out, that's the kind of investment VC thinks of. Why the government doesn't think this way, it's astounding to me until you remember that those really big companies that are trying to control the folks that make the decisions on the economic incentives and things, like they're the ones that are funding the elections and the general assembly.
What?
So that's what we're up against. But smart money would invest in the ESOs, and and 100 million for the state of North Carolina would be an incredibly easy budget appropriation.
Yeah, I mean, I have said on just about any occasion I have that we could 5x our grant making in the ecosystem space. Might not be able to 5x it on the seed, grants, because there's, as as one of our, trusted long-serving reviewers, where we draw the line. Here are the 6 companies getting funded, and here's number 7, the first one that missed the cut, and number 8. 7 and 8 and 9, I'll let the listeners in on a secret. They're just as worthy of the funding. That is an arbitrary, or not arbitrary. It's definitely not arbitrary. I'll say subjective. It's a subjective process, and we are forced to draw that line based upon limitations in our own funding. But we could 2, 3x, and then there is always a cliff. There is a cliff predicated upon the collective reviews and everybody being of the opinion, and more often than not, it's just simply they're not ready yet. These are still, the cliff usually breaks where the companies that are below that line are just a little too nascent. But by the next cycle, we hope they're competitive again. But in the ecosystem space, we could 5, 10x that output, because there's that much work to be done. And to your point, the ROI is a no-brainer. It's an absolute no-brainer. But I feel sometimes maybe we're just not talking to the right people, or it might have something to do with that political influence you were alluding to.
I think we undervalue the ROI as well. You mentioned 5,000 jobs, I think, a minute ago. Those are the direct jobs in the organizations that you fund. There's lots of different kind of economic models and things out there. There's not a hard, fast rule, but those 5,000 jobs are creating something like 2.5 additional indirect jobs per job when they are these higher paying jobs like you have in the technology sector. And so the actual impact is that quite a bit more than just the 5,000 jobs.
Yeah, I know. M-Plan, I'm familiar with M-Plan as one of those measurement tools. And I can tell you just from my own entrepreneurial experience, the last company that I was a founder of, as it was growing, we were in just really low rent part of, not a good part of downtown Cleveland, right? Because that's all we could afford. And as such, we had a fenced in exclusive parking lot just for our office, complete with barbed wire going across the top. But, as the CEO of the company, I was the primary salesperson. So I would come and go throughout the day on sales calls. And one of the things that I loved doing is I'd come back from a sales call, and particularly a good one where, I felt good. We were about to get a new account, and I would count the cars in the parking lot, because I knew each one of those cars belonged to one of our employees. And that was, those were mortgages being paid. Those were car loans being paid. Those were families being supported. Those were groceries. I think that's, for me, that might've been kind of the precursor for the work I do now, that I connected directly, with the economic impact of having created a business that at the time I left had over 40 employees, right? That's not insignificant, especially for the communities that they're in and what our employees gave back to the communities. So yeah, I know we're on the same page there. One of the many things that you do, and I think I've told you this before, like I'm actually jealous of, because we did this when I was at Kauffman. We would do this annual State of Entrepreneurship address, and you've cornered that market. So, um, you know, I would like you to share, if you could. It's by the way, here's just a overt plug for anybody listening. If you get a chance to see Tom Snyder's State of Entrepreneurship address, I highly recommend it. It's very informative. It's like getting a free guest lecture from like just an esteemed faculty member. Based upon that work, where do you think we're going? We've kind of grown up together in this space. We've seen a lot of change, you and I, right? And not just in North Carolina, more broadly. And I know you've been tracking this, obviously, for that long plug I just gave for your State of Entrepreneurship address. Please share with the listeners, like, where do you think this is going?
It's a great question, and thank you for the kind words. We have a lot of fun with that. We do it right about the time that the president does the State of the Union. We call it the State of the Region, and it started as just this fun thing, and then the audience kept getting bigger and bigger, and we thought, oh gosh, let's make sure all our facts are right and everything else. But what I think has changed over the last decade of doing this kind of work is we went from like kind of entrepreneurship 1.0 now to a period where we're kind of in what I think of as entrepreneurship 2.0. And what I mean by that is that there have always been entrepreneurs. A lot of them were kind of just working in the shadows, and folks didn't know about the companies that were doing things because there weren't accelerator programs. There weren't media outlets like a Gretbeat here in the Triangle that are just telling the stories of these startup companies and so on. And so people were starting businesses, but it was just part of what they did. And some of them were successful and some weren't. But now there's this broader recognition. There's been an education across a broader swath of society about entrepreneurship. And some of the folks that started businesses, 10, 15, 20 years ago and have had an exit, they are now leading the local angel group that's investing in the next generation. They're starting to provide mentorship to the next generation of entrepreneurs. And it's really healthy in an ecosystem when you've had some successes that then can give back to the next generation. So that's what I mean by this 2.0 is we're seeing the capacity to support entrepreneurs grow in terms of awareness, in terms of on-roads. A decade ago, there were just a small, everybody that was doing this work, say in the Research Triangle, we could have fit in one conference room. Now we couldn't fit in the convention center. And so there's more resources, there's more people involved, there's more capital that is becoming available. There's, I think, most importantly, more mentorship and things that's becoming available. So I think that's really a positive. I think the other positive is particularly in your mid-market and smaller communities, they're just recognizing that this is the path to overcoming the job losses that happen due to globalization, primarily due to globalization. And there was a period in time where city councils and others never would have thought of investing in the kind of work that you or I do. And now we're increasingly seeing not only a willingness, but this is going to be the keystone of economic development strategy over the next decade. And that's really exciting. We don't see it everywhere, but we're seeing the tides changing, I think, in a positive direction. On the flip side, I don't think we've seen any change in corporate behavior. In fact, the corporate behavior continues to get worse. And by corporate, I mean like the really, the publicly traded companies, the really big ones that lay off half the workforce so that they can boost CEO pay and do stock buybacks, like that kind of stuff. It's just not changing. Unfortunately, money's getting bigger and bigger in politics, which means that we're not necessarily seeing the policy changes, say at the federal and state level, at the pace that we would like. I will say there are pockets of really brave and creative people in both federal and state government that are trying to do good things. And there's pilot studies that are happening that are good. But but at a broad level, we're not yet there.
Yeah, I'm not convinced that our political process is on a net basis a positive. I think, especially during crazy election years like we're in right now, I think they actually um, swing negative, like on a net basis. I have to take issue with something you just said, though,
Sure.
and brace yourself for this. You said, I don't know that we could fit everybody doing this work in one convention center. As this podcast will be dropping on day one of our ecosystem summit, I would like to point out we're going to try. We'll get several hundred people into one convention center. Everybody like-minded around how we do this at the state level with our statewide ecosystem summit. No doubt there are probably for every one attending, there are 10 more, people supporting and behind the scenes. So just had to do a shameless plug for the summit. The other thing you touched on, which we, again, it's very partisan. We saw that with the creation of NC Innovation, a partner that we have the good fortune of collaborating on some work right now with them. But that whole process, and I just have the utmost respect for the team that they were able to navigate the political morass to get that set up. It's unfortunately, I think the process is going to make it ultimately much harder for success than it needs to be. That's unfortunate to me because I can't think of a reason to do it other than just naked partisanship, right? Which adds nothing. I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat, right? If you want to help us, torture sports metaphor here, cross the goal line, then let's do it together. I remember having in a polite conversation, in a polite event, having a conversation with a staffer for a particular senator of a particular party, that is kind of that civil libertarian mantra, right? Like, government can't be involved and blah, blah, blah. And when he started asking me questions about NCIDEA and what we've done, and I said, we've helped fund 600 nascent startups, get them out of the starting block. We connect them with private equity. We love on them with mentoring and programming from our ecosystem partners. And they've gone on and raised, $1 billion in private equity and created 5,000 jobs. And they're like, oh, the guy was just like, that's fantastic. Why don't we have more NC ideas? And I said, I don't know, because we were created when the state took an equity position in a tech company in the late 90s. And when that company exited, the state had a carried interest that created the initial corpus of our endowment. So we were created during a time where we had the political courage to say investing in ourselves makes sense, right? I don't know when we got to this point that everything has to be zero risk. Government can't do anything, first of all, because again, some civil libertarian wet dream of separation of powers and shouldn't be having a hand in the economy. That's just a joke. The continent was discovered when Queen Isabella, I think was her name, hawked her crown jewels to fund some guy that wanted to get in a ship and go across the ocean, right? Christopher Columbus was not a successful entrepreneur at that time and self-funded his little voyage, right? The internet was created because of government spending. We didn't, Elon Musk wasn't the first to get us up to space, right? The government did that before. So this notion that like the government can't be involved and we have to be so risk averse because it's taxpayer money. Well, so it's taxpayer money when you give Apple $1 billion of relief, right? Like it's like we're not even playing by the same rules.
Well, I'll share where North Carolina can learn. I mean, we go back and forth year over year in the CNBC rankings. Is North Carolina number one or number two? And we're flipping back and forth with the state of Virginia. Well, Virginia is number one right now. And full disclosure, they're a client of ours. They pay us to do some of the work that we do out of the state budget.
It's probably why they're number one.
Well, I won't take credit for that. But what I will say is that they invest, they take equity positions in startups. Now, the General Assembly doesn't do it directly. They fund a nonprofit organization called the Virginia Innovation Partnership Corporation to steward that money on the behalf of the state to make investment decisions to fund entrepreneurial sport organizations like ourselves and to capitalize on that opportunity. And it's a really simple mechanism by which the state can use some taxpayer money in a very strategic way. Is it zero risk? No. Is it low risk? Yes, particularly with a portfolio approach. And you know, they're doing that. We have a wonderful organization like yourself doing it, completely outside the government at this point. But aside from that first creative, I'll call it a pilot study in the 90s, I'm not aware that there's really much going on at all at the state level. Now, the NC Innovation Project is a great example of where maybe we're starting to see some new exploration. And I would like to see the state do more of those kind of things. But having an equity return seems like a logical next step. If you even indirectly have an equity position in a company, is that going to create even more impetus for that company to stay in the place where they were initially funded, to keep the jobs in the place where they were initially funded? Every state should be doing this.
I couldn't agree more. And I just, this notion of this risk aversion. First of all, when did we become so frightened, scared? And what in life is guaranteed? Nothing. So the assumption of some risk should just be in the milieu that you accept. And obviously, you do postmortems on every transaction. You do the trend analysis, like what worked in the big successes. What were the causes for the failures. Do more of the former, less of the latter. Over time, your batting average goes up, right? I mean, it's not that complicated.
I don't think, though, that we're scared when I say we, like, say the state government is scared of the potential backlash of an investment that didn't go well. This happens all the time with the tax incentives for big companies that come and then they don't create the jobs and it doesn't go well. Clearly, the backlash of using money inappropriately, or not inappropriately, but using money that doesn't have the desired outcome, isn't scaring away the behavior of using money to support business. I think the fear is using money to support that startup company that's going to displace the existing industry, and that existing industry player is the one that's contributing to my campaign. That, I would say, is the root cause of the rot.
So are you suggesting there's a problem with money in politics?
Citizens United said that money is free speech. I fundamentally disagree. Money is an amplifier of free speech. It is not fundamentally free speech. But
yeah, and corporations are
we
people.
are where we are.
But yeah, that's a podcast of a different name.
That's right.
And that should be like over some libations and with a full disclaimer and disclosure on the trigger warning at the beginning. Listen, I have enjoyed immensely this time together, and I look for any excuse to hang out with you. We're trying to do something consistent across these episodes. So I want to stay consistent with that and share with you just some trivia. Would you be surprised to know that you and I have 295 mutual connections on LinkedIn?
That's cool.
Would you consider that high or low?
I will first share that I don't even know how many requests to connect. I do not connect with people unless I can vouch for them. Some people connect with anyone on LinkedIn just for the network effect of the tool. So I only connect with people I can vouch for. And so the fact that we have that many that we both know, that we both vouch for, I think is significant.
I do too. And it puts you kind of, somebody else that was in that ballpark is an individual that we both have tried to help, and that's Desmond Wigan at Battery Exchange. Am I remembering correctly? Didn't Desmond go through one of your accelerator programs?
Yeah, I love Des. He went through, I don't remember which cohort, but has done just a phenomenal job.
Yeah, and we feel likewise. He's actually one of those He's in the rare six-figure club of NC Idea funded companies because not only did he get the seed grant, but he also got one of the Black Entrepreneurship Council's growth grants. So he clocks in at 125, and I might even be off by 10 if he also got, I can't remember if he got a micro as well. So he's extracted at least 125 grand out of the process, if not 135. But yeah, I've got 344 mutual connections with him. So we're right there in that. I ironically, or not ironically, but interestingly, as I did the analysis, I thought this would be kind of like in the ballpark of the high end, but there's one contact I have, Ted Zoller
I know Ted.
at UNC. He and I have 1,101 mutual connections. And a lot of that comes from our shared time at the Kauffman Foundation. So if you look at the geographic distribution of those networks, it spans the globe. But I don't know. I take it. This little, riff about this is probably the most useful thing I've taken out of LinkedIn because, like you, I am declining so many every day. One of the more challenging things I have is that even though we don't take equity in our grant fundings, for some reason, PitchBook still classifies them. And I am, by PitchBook standards, I am a big time investor from a volume standpoint, which means that via email, I get 3 to 5 unsolicited pitch decks per day. And if I had a piece of advice for founders, sending your pitch deck, unsolicited anonymously to somebody, a name you pulled out of PitchBook, if that ain't desperation, I don't know what is, right? And I'm going to say this right now. If you're listening to this podcast and you've been successful doing that, please reach out to me. I would love to hear your story on how that happened, because, I've got this standard, junk. I got the junk finger all figured out and can press that button vigorously.
And I never wax philosophical or anything, but I'm going to do that for a moment here, right? So
please.
We run an accelerator program. We do not teach anyone to write a pitch deck. We do not have a pitch deck as part of our program at all. We spend 12 weeks or more with companies. It is the least important thing for a founder to learn how to do. If you're starting a company, your job is to determine how does that company make revenue. And founders that are out unsolicitedly sending pitch decks, like, that's the first flag for me that this is probably a founder that hasn't figured out what they need to be successful. So, whether you have been doing this a while and you're trying to raise money for the right reasons to fund some growth, or to, there are good reasons to raise money, but the people doing it for good reasons aren't sending those unsolicited decks. We think of entrepreneurial support as creating sustainable jobs. And that means creating sustainable companies. And companies, by the way, tend not to be sustainable if they don't continue to grow. We want companies that grow, that continue to scale and create jobs, and we like scalable companies. We have about 85% of the companies we work with are still viable companies 3 years after we work with them. If you look at your typical venture-backed accelerators that are teaching you to make pitch decks, teaching you to raise money, that are taking an equity position in your startup, like the big brand ones, I won't name them here, but the big name brand accelerators everybody's heard of, have somewhere between 10 and 15% of companies are still viable companies 3 years later. They are working to turn your company into an investment vehicle to scale as fast as possible, to suck as much wealth out of as possible, and then you might be on your way or not. But if you're not growing at the pace they want, you're just discarded to the side. So raising money, if you're early stage raising money, most likely is not the right strategy. Raise revenue.
Yeah. Grow yourself into success. We had this, I was talking to another guest on the podcast, and we were talking about that here, we offer a little more practical approach where we focus on profitability, right? Whereas on the coast, it might be, don't worry about profitability. We'll just keep raising, right? And that'll become a problem for tomorrow. I think that's part of what draws people to this region. Listen, I don't know how to add anything of value above and beyond what you've said. So I think this is probably where we'll wrap. But let me say first, thank you. Thank you for your friendship. Thank you for our partnership at the ecosystem partner level. Thank you for being a valued reviewer in our grant program. And thank you for what you do. You and the entire team and Rachel over there, you guys, you've really put North Carolina on the map, especially in the IoT sector. And I know a lot of that's hard work. It's educational. In the early days, I sat through, Professor Snyder's lectures on what IoT is and how it transcends every other vertical that we get excited about in this state. And I think it's just going to be, when the history of the state is written, you're going to be more than a footnote, to be certain. So thank you for that.
Really appreciate that. Thank you for your partnership and friendship over the years as well. It was the great John Austin, who was in your organization for many years, that introduced me to Rachel Newberry, who's been instrumental in our program. So thank you to my team, to all of our partners. I will be at that ecosystem summit. I would encourage anyone, if you're listening to this and you can, change, turn left instead of turning right and get down there, go to it. I'll put the challenge out back to you, Tom. That's not just fill the convention center. Let's try and get in a few years into a stadium. Let's continue to grow this ecosystem. If anyone who's listening to this wants to learn more about what we do, you can find us at riot.org. I'll be at the ecosystem summit as well. We work with corporate partners that want to add fuel to this. We work with government partners that want to work on either policy or local strategy. And of course, we're here to serve entrepreneurs. And I'd be remiss for not saying that if you're an entrepreneur working on something early stage, we will not take any equity position in your company, and we won't charge you any money. So we would love to hear from anyone that's looking for help.
That's very generous. And if we're going to make that stadium challenge, if there are policymakers that tune into this, if we ever got to that tipping point, then I think it would be more than just hyperbolic flattery or hopefulness. I think we actually could get to that point, but we're going to need policymakers to fundamentally change what they define as economic development best practices. But like I said, we'll keep that topic for another discussion at another time. Thanks again, Tom. It was great hanging out with you today.
Yeah, you too, Tom. Thank you.
Stay connected with NC IDEA on LinkedIn, Facebook, and X, and subscribe to our newsletter for all the latest. Catch new episodes of Ecosysteming every other Tuesday. Thanks for tuning in and being a part of this thing of ours.